the very first thing we have to do before we start looking at what Jesus answered is we have to answer this question. Has the temple been destroyed? This prophecy that Jesus gave them, because now he's going to spend verses and verses that we're going to look at, where he says all these terrible things that are going to happen in response to the disciples' question. So did that come true? Did Jesus' prophecy that he told them in verse 2, that this temple is going to be destroyed, 2 stones will need to be standing, has that happened? Well, the answer to that question is an undoubtedly yes, it did. Because in AD 70, let me show you this picture. In AD 70, the Romans came, 20,000 Roman soldiers came to Jerusalem, and they completely obliterated Jerusalem. They ransacked the temple and they burned it to the ground. They tore it up so completely that it was just a pile of burned rubble. There were not 2 stones standing on top of each other. So yes, Jesus's prophecy that he gave the disciples completely happened. And it happened in AD 70. In AD 70. Okay. So that was only 40 years after Jesus left, after he ascended back up into heaven. So it was not that long. So this was an example of a complete, very quickly fulfilled prophecy. Because everything, you're going to see that everything Jesus says after that, all of these things happened either before or around AD 70, when Jerusalem was completely destroyed by the Romans. Okay, and when the Romans came in and did all that, they murdered over 1 million Jewish people. This was AD 70. So can you imagine how much of a percentage of the population of the Jewish people, 1 million people were back then? After all of those people were murdered, there were very few Jewish people left. And then they also took almost 100,000 Jews, took them as slaves, took them back to Rome. A lot of them were then continued to tortured and used for sport and terrible things. So there were very few Jewish people who escaped. And those Jewish people who escaped, then they were scattered all over the world. And after this temple, this Jerusalem was so completely destroyed that after this, there was no Jerusalem. There was no nation of Israel after AD 70. It was not until 1948, if you know this part of our history, in 1948, the Jewish people were allowed to come back, to return to this area where Israel had been, and to restore their nation and to rebuild the nation of Israel and the city of Jerusalem. So, but from AD 70 until 1948, almost 2,000 years, there was no Israel. There was no Jerusalem. There is the Jewish people who remained, they had no homeland, and they were scattered all over the world. And yet they were able to maintain their national identity, so that almost 2,000 years later, they were able to come back and to rebuild the nation of Israel that you know today, that is a powerful, powerful nation. So never in the history of all humanity has there been anything like it, that there's a people group that is so completely destroyed, has no homeland, and they've been scattered all over the world for 2,000 years, and yet are able to come back and rebuild their nation. The only reason that has happened, that is a huge miracle, and it is because they are God's chosen people, and God has had his hand on them, and he has always preserved a remnant of his chosen people.